Hey class, this video is going to look at interactions that happen between species who tend to co-occur with one another and how these so-called biotic interactions tend to drive this very special kind of evolution that we call coevolution, which is basically a word that represents the idea that sometimes species can evolve together. And when we think about biotic interactions, ecologists and evolutionary biologists generally view these interactions as having either positive, neutral, or negative fitness outcomes for the parties involved or for the pairs of species that are involved. And we can see this framework sort of illustrated here, where we have two different species that are potentially interacting with each other in the environment. And these two different species can experience these positive, neutral, or negative effects depending on the interaction they're having with a second species, which is also experiencing either positive, neutral, or negative effects during this interaction. And basically, these types of interactions lead to a few kinds of outcomes, things like mutualisms, commensalisms, amensalisms, competition, or perhaps predation or parasitism. So we'll sort of walk through some examples of these. One example would be species one and species two. Both are doing things that have a positive effect on the fitness of one another, such as we see with yucca moths and the yucca plants that they pollinate. And so we would call that a mutualism. We have other situations where there might be a neutral effect on one species and a positive effect on another, and we would call that a commensalism. And so we see that with cattle egrets, who basically use these cattle as hosts, and the cattle don't really seem to be affected by the presence of the egrets whatsoever. Basically, all these egrets do is feed off insects that happen to hang around the cattle. And so the egrets are benefiting from a meal. The cattle aren't being affected at all, so there's no effect on them, but a positive effect on the egrets, and so that's what we call a commensalism. Probably maybe more familiar is this idea where there's an interaction between two species in which there's a positive effect on one species, but a negative effect on the other, and we might call that predation. For example, this grasshopper feeding on this leafy plant here. The grasshopper is indeed benefiting from the nutrients and sugars that it's getting out of this plant as a meal, and the plant is suffering fitness consequences because it's losing biomass. It's losing leaf tissue that would otherwise be undergoing photosynthesis and providing the plant host with more energy. So that is one example of something we call predation. Positive effect on one species, negative effect on the other. A similar situation where we have a positive effect on one species and a negative effect on the other is something called parasitism, where we have a parasite and a host. And one example of this, again, with plants, are these things called snow plants that are pretty common in the forested environments of California. Maybe you've seen them before. But one interesting thing you might notice about these snow plants is that they are not green. And in fact, this is an indication that they do not perform any photosynthesis whatsoever. So in order for them to get energy from the environment, they have to steal it from hosts that are available in the surrounding environment. So oftentimes these snow plants have structures that will tap into the roots of other host plants or perhaps even into fungal networks in the environment. Whatever host they happen to be tapping into, they are gaining a positive fitness effect because they're getting sugar from the host. And they don't provide anything in return to the host for this sort of theft of sugar. And so that's having a negative effect on the host. So this is just one example of how parasitism works. It's kind of like predation. It's just happening in a kind of different way. We can talk about parasitism between other kinds of host-parasite relationships like viruses and their hosts. So viruses might potentially have very negative fitness effects on their hosts as well. We have this other thing called amensalism, which in some ways is kind of like the opposite of commensalism, where there's going to be a negative effect on one individual and a neutral effect on the other. And an example of that might be these little saplings that are growing up underneath the canopy of larger trees. These are walnuts, by the way. And these walnut saplings basically don't have a very good chance of surviving because they're sort of being swamped out of sunlight. So they can't really grow very well. They're not really doing an adequate amount of photosynthesis to ever really be able to grow up into mature trees. However, this has absolutely no effect on the mature tree that the sapling is growing next to. So this relationship would be considered an amensalism. And then the last kind of interaction is the one that has a negative effect on both parties involved, and that is something we would call competition. So we can look at these rodents here, and these rodents are competing for some kind of presumably limited food resource in the environment, and so this is actually leading to negative fitness consequences for both parties involved. And if there wasn't competition here, if one of these rodents didn't have to compete with the other, it would have higher fitness than it does in the situation where it is forced to compete. So again, this is the framework by which we sort of understand how biotic interactions play out, what the outcomes of them are. And as we'll see, this tends to be sort of important for playing into this process we call coevolution. And coevolution is something that was discussed by Charles Darwin back in the 19th century. And Charles Darwin knew about these orchids here. And these orchids have some pretty interesting morphologies or physical characteristics. In particular, these really long nectar spurs. And so the female reproductive parts of these orchids are down here, and the nectar is available. The nectar that they're producing is available to pollinators within this very long spur. And Darwin knew about these flowers. He was sent specimens of them by people who had made collections, but nobody knew about the pollinators at the time. However, Darwin correctly predicted that somewhere in this environment, there must be a pollinating animal that has the proper type of morphology to reach down into this floral tube. And unfortunately for Darwin, he never got to see this animal, but as it was discovered somewhat later, about 40 years later, it turns out that these sphinx moths are the pollinators of this orchid. And these sphinx moths have evolved these really, really long proboscises that can reach into this floral tube. Huh, that's kind of interesting. How did this happen? Well, it probably happened via some type of a biotic interaction. And as it turns out, this type of biotic interaction appears to be a mutualism, where both the orchid and the moth are gaining some fitness benefits from this relationship. The orchid is getting pollinated, it's having its genes or its sperm transferred from one plant to the eggs of another, and so that's helping it reproduce. And at the same time, this moth here is getting a meal. And so there's a positive interaction between these two. And we typically refer to this kind of coevolution as something that we call specific coevolution. And so in this graph here, this hypothetical graph, we have these two different colored lines. And these two different colored lines really do represent our species pairs that are interacting. And what we see on the x-axis is time going by, really evolutionary time, and the value of some hypothetical traits that these individuals have. So for example, the red line might be the orchid, and the blue line might be the moth. And the red line might represent the length of the floral tube on the y-axis, and this blue line might be responding to that. And so the trait value in this case is the length of the proboscis. And over time, as natural selection is favoring longer and longer floral tubes in these orchids, it is also favoring longer and longer proboscises in these moths. And there's very much this parallel sort of concomitant pattern of evolution, which we would call coevolution. These two species are evolving together. A trait in one is causing selection to act upon a trait in the other, and this kind of goes back and forth in a concomitant fashion. A sort of fancier way that coevolution can play out is in this model called escape and radiate. And this is more like when we're looking at perhaps a interaction between two species in which one species is gaining fitness, but the other is not, such as the relationship between a parasite and its host. And in this hypothetical example, we might think of the red sort of phylogeny here representing evolution of a host, and this blue phylogeny here that's paralleling it representing the parasite. And over time, it appears that the host has evolved and adapted to overcome the negative effects of its parasite to the point where the parasite lineage goes extinct. And this is a positive benefit to the host, and whatever traits allowed host lineages to overcome its parasite are sort of magnified in the population, very much favored by selection. And this leads to a situation where perhaps this particular lineage now has the chance to diversify. But then the situation gets kind of complicated because maybe later on down the road, a new parasite emerges, and this parasite has evolved to overcome the traits that its host have that originally enabled it to resist the first parasite. And so this causes radiation or diversification of the host lineage in order to overcome this parasite, which in turn, because of coevolution, is also undergoing diversification or radiation as it's responding to different traits that the host has so that it can still be an effective parasite. So the way that coevolution plays out is kind of complicated, but just know that at the very root of how it's happening are these different kinds of biotic interactions, and natural selection is acting on them because they have a direct effect on the fitnesses of the species or the parties that are involved. Now, sometimes one of the interesting outcomes of coevolution is this thing called crypsis. And within different environments, species can undergo crypsis simply via natural selection, but they can also undergo crypsis via natural selection, but also via coevolution. And some classic examples of crypsis we can see are in these snakes, these adders, whose morphology is very, very closely matched to the environment in which they occur. The relationship between these katydids and the leaves that they live upon has led these katydids to have a very leaf-like morphology. This is an insect upon a leaf, but that insect looks like a leaf. So by virtue of this insect using leaf environments for habitat, really, selection has favored these katydids that have leaf-like morphology, probably because it makes them less susceptible to predation. We can see things like this flying lizard, or maybe you can't see it at all because it's so well camouflaged into the habitat that it lives on, which is the bark of this tree here. Likewise, these panthers have become really, have developed these coat colors or this coat pattern that's very, very similar to the sort of surrounding vegetation. And so the morphology or the physical characteristics of the vegetation has sort of allowed this type of coat pattern in these panthers to become favored. And this is sort of like an example of coevolution. Likewise, or in a sort of similar way, we can see the snowshoe hares who have a coat color very well matched to the color of snow. Again, presumably a feature that allows them to sort of negate being subject to being eaten. So it lowers their chances of becoming prey. Or things like these southern desert-born lizards, which sort of like the adders, have morphological features that allow them to blend into the environment very well. And in the case of the adder and the horned lizard, this probably allows them not to be so much less susceptible to predation as it allows them to be better predators. Although in some ways, it probably could help them be less susceptible to predation as well. But anyway, these are different examples of different situations where we see natural selection has really favored some interesting physical characteristics in organisms that really do match the environment in which they occur. And in some cases, this environment is a biotic environment where, again, the species involved are having interaction with other species. And something kind of similar, but not quite the same as crypsis, is this thing called aposematic coloration. And this is basically the situation where selection has favored really bright colors in different organisms that are signals to other organisms that this individual is somehow a threat. And this has happened in all kinds of different taxonomic groups, some of which are quite distantly related from one another. But we can see examples of these really bright purplish sea stars, or these bright yellow vipers, or things like black widows that have this red coloration, or things like these milkweed locusts with this red coloration, or even these poison dart frogs, again, with this sort of really bright reddish coloration, or even things like the stripes of skunks. And the thinking behind this is that certain colors to organisms that have vision, that can see, are really at the neurological level a sign of threat. And natural selection has favored pigments within these organisms that produce these colors that are a signal of a sign of threat. And so, a lot of times, this situation can be very, very beneficial to the species that have developed mutations that give them these sort of threatening colors. So, it seems pretty clear that natural selection is favoring aposematic coloration in a multitude of different organisms. But how does this relate to coevolution? Well, as it turns out, this kind of is something leading to another process that we call mimicry. And in some cases, organisms who produce aposematic coloration might not actually be harmful, but selection is favoring these colors because there are other organisms in the same environment, or not too different environments, that are harmful that have similar aposematic coloration. For example, perhaps this milkweed locust is not nearly as harmful as a black widow spider, but if selection has favored similar coloration in the milkweed locust, sort of as a form of mimicry, this the physical characteristics of this locust are sort of maybe mimicking the physical characteristics of other insects in a similar environment that are more harmful, this could be favorable to increasing the fitness of the locust. And so this kind of leads to this idea that there is some level of coevolution going on here. Mimicry is really this process that causes the evolution of one species to be affected by another. And this is kind of classic coevolution. And there are a couple ways this happens. One of the famous ways is via this thing we call Batesian mimicry. And this is a situation where the phenotypes of what we call palatable mimics match unpalatable models. And so when we're talking about palatability, we're talking about whether or not these different individuals are going to be a tasty meal to a particular predator. And so rather than them having necessarily aposematic coloration that signals them as a threat. Some of them might just taste bad, but this does turn out to relate to color. And a classic example of this comes from butterflies. And as it turns out, there's pretty strong mimetic polymorphism in these swallowtail butterflies. And this almost exclusively seems to be going on with the females rather than the males. But in any case, it turns out that female swallowtail butterflies, which are palatable, they are a very viable food source to predators, have been selected for mimicking a bunch of unpalatable models. And so these different females look a lot like different species that are unpalatable when these females themselves are in fact palatable. So these females could be eaten and they're not toxic, whereas these different models are unpalatable and potentially toxic, certainly not a good meal. And so natural selection has really worked on favoring this coevolutionary process where, via the fact that these different female swallowtails have come to resemble a lot of unpalatable models, they can evade predation. And this seems to have certainly played out in a lot of ways. So we can, again, see examples of that here, where we have a couple sets of mimics and a couple sets of models. Again, swallowtail butterflies mimicking other different swallowtail butterflies that are unpalatable, and selection is favoring this via coevolution. Also, things like these snakes. So, California mountain king snakes have aposematic coloration, and it turns out that their morphology or their physical characteristics are a lot like those of the Texas coral snake, which are harmful, venomous snakes. And so, again, these mountain king snakes are not venomous, but by virtue of selection, favoring these characteristics, this aposematic coloration, which very much resembles that of the venomous Texas coral snake. These snakes have done better to avoid predation, and natural selection has favored this through mimicry, again, via the process of coevolution. And in this case, we can kind of look at coevolution being a little bit one-sided, where traits that originally emerged in these models aren't really being affected so much by traits in the mimics, but the mimics are very much co-evolving around traits in their models. So that's pretty much how we think of this thing that we call Batesian mimicry. A similar form of mimicry instead is what we call Mullerian mimicry. And in this case, now the phenotypes of unpalatable mimics match that of unpalatable models. So in this case, both species involved, or the species involved, are in one way or another harmful. So for example, we could look at these other butterflies, and as it turns out, we might have a couple different phenotypes within the mimics, both of which are unpalatable. And then we have this model, which is very unpalatable as well. And as it turns out, selection is favoring the phenotypes in these mimics that are more closely resembling those of the model. And as we can see, if the phenotypes of the mimics matches that of the model, it will be favored and really basically increase the fitness of the mimics. And that's kind of what we're seeing in these graphs here, where if we do an experiment and we release these two different mimic phenotypes into nature, probably the ones that match the model phenotype better are going to have higher fitness. Same is true in this example over here as well. We also see this going on in hymenopterans, stinging hymenopterans. And these hymenopterans, some of which are sort of in different groups, share mimetic and aposematic coloration. So there's some level of mimicry here, where selection has favored these different hymenopterans having sort of very similar kinds of colors. They're black and yellow for the most part. And this sort of black and yellow coloration is also aposematic. It is a signal to potential threats, say potential predators, for example, that, hey, stay away from me or I will deliver a very painful or even potentially deadly sting. And so across honeybees, hornets, yellow jackets, and wasps, who are kind of in different groups of hymenopterans, we see these kinds of traits being favored via natural selection. So that's another example of this thing we call Mullerian mimicry. It's just the difference between this and Batesian mimicry is we have organisms who are all equally sort of harmful mimicking each other, whereas in the case of Batesian mimicry, we have organisms who are not harmful at all mimicking those that are harmful. So these are two kinds of different ways that we think of mimicry as happening. Now, another consequence of sort of long-term evolutionary species interactions is this thing called a coevolutionary arms race. And this basically happens when traits of one species evolve in response to the selection pressures that are being imposed upon them by some other species. And probably one of the most classic examples of this might come again with these sort of predator-prey relationships. So again, we're seeing a form of biotic interaction where there's a positive influence on one species, a negative influence on another. And in this case, probably the positive influence is being enjoyed by this cheetah, and a potential negative consequence is emerging for this gazelle, which is its prey. And so what's kind of going on in the relationship between cheetahs and gazelles is that at some point in time, natural selection has favored some rather extreme traits in both species. For example, selection may have originally favored increased running speed in the gazelle. Gazelles are pretty fast ungulates. But in turn, selection then starts to favor faster running speed in cheetahs, because cheetahs who can't catch gazelles as prey are going to have lower fitness. But in turn, gazelles that are getting caught by cheetahs and eaten don't really have very high fitness necessarily either. So selection might turn around and start favoring increasingly faster speed in in gazelles. And then this might in turn lead to selection favoring increasingly faster speed in cheetahs. And so over time, we see that the speed of cheetahs and gazelles is being selected to increase in speed over and over and over again via this sort of coevolutionary arms race being really driven by natural selection. And this kind of has limitations because there comes a point where there are physical constraints on just how fast a gazelle could run based on their sort of physiology and body plan. And we could say the same thing about cheetahs. There are limitations on how fast these cheetahs can run based also on their physiology and body plans. So coevolutionary arms races kind of tend to reach an endpoint where there's a balance between how extreme the traits of either of the two parties can become, but it's very much an outcome of this coevolutionary process. We see something similar going on in the relationship between these weevils and these host plants. Uh, and basically what we're seeing is that uh, the two kind of contrasting traits in this coevolutionary arms race are the pericarp thickness of the fruits that these weevils eat. So the pericarp is just basically the fruit or the covering of the fruit, I should say. And these weevils have these things called rostrum or rostrums. And it turns out that in this particular example, we can see that the length of the rostrum in these weevils varies. And it seems to vary in a significant way depending on the thickness of the covering of the fruits that they are trying to feed on. And it looks like in this image or this graph here that as the thickness of these pericarps, these fruit coverings, increases in size, it's driving selection for increased length in the rostrum of the weevils. And so we kind of see this interesting dichotomy where there are certain situations where the weevils have the advantage and certain situations where these fruits or the plants that have these fruits that they're trying to feed on have the advantage. And it seems like in this situation that there's an advantage to the weevils when the pericarps are kind of not too thick and their rostrums don't have to be too long. But as these plant coverings, these pericarps start to become thicker and thicker, the weevils are having a harder and harder time evolving longer rostrum to get into these fruits for food. It's happening to a certain extent, but when we cross this sort of line here, we're seeing the situation where the plants kind of have an advantage because they have thicker pericarps and not a lot of weevils have very long rostrums. Now, this whole situation is sort of like coevolution in action. Over time, maybe mutations will arise in these weevils that give rise to longer and longer rostrums that allow them to sort of take advantage of these plants. And in turn, maybe over time, these plants will start to evolve to have thicker and thicker pericarps, thicker and thicker coverings to their fruit in response to the predation pressures being imposed upon them by these weevils. And so this is just kind of a couple examples of how we can talk about coevolutionary arms races unfolding, where there's just back and forth evolution between different lineages that are interacting with each other. And there are plenty of other examples of this as well. But it's something that's certainly very much not uncommon in the context of both predator-prey or sort of plant-herbivore interactions. Again, situations where we have a positive effect on the fitness of one species, but a negative effect on the fitness of another. Now we can see more examples of this sort of coevolutionary armed race kind of process unfolding in plants. And particularly in plants that are producing secondary chemicals or so-called secondary metabolites that are selected for their anti-herbivory properties. So plants in particular are very vulnerable, very susceptible to herbivory or predation. Basically, herbivory is a fancy word for predation upon plants. And so these secondary chemicals or secondary metabolites are basically the byproducts of normal plant physiology. So plants undergo metabolism in a similar way to animals. They basically have to take the energy that they get via photosynthesis, process it, use it to grow and try to reproduce. But sometimes a byproduct of that normal metabolic process are chemicals that are very, very harmful to potential predators. And as it turns out, many of these chemicals are familiar because they are toxic, they are drugs. So things like morphine. or things like cocaine, or things like caffeine or nicotine. All of these things are potentially very toxic to herbivores. Now, obviously, humans have been capable of digesting some of this stuff. In some cases, uh, extreme dosages of these types of things like morphine or cocaine could be lethal to humans. It's less likely that humans are going to die from consuming lots of caffeine or lots of nicotine. They might get very sick from it, but humans are fairly large animals, whereas a lot of herbivores that are feeding on these plants are quite small, like insects, for example, or smaller mammals or birds. And so these organisms, by virtue of being much smaller, are much more likely to have very, very harmful effects due to consuming even small amounts of these chemicals, even things like caffeine and nicotine. And so there's been this interesting back and forth, probably this back and forth coevolution where these plants have inadvertently been creating these chemicals, these harmful chemicals, as a byproduct of their normal physiology. The chemicals don't really benefit the plants in any other way, other than defending them from potential herbivores. And maybe the herbivores have, in some cases, evolved to tolerate some of these chemicals, thus leading back to selection favoring plants that are producing higher concentrations of these secondary chemicals. And so this is again sort of like an arms race. And an interesting feature of this situation that we see is that these plants are all really kind of distantly related from one another. They are all in different plant families. Plants that produce morphine are in a completely different family than plants that produce cocaine. Likewise, plants that produce caffeine are in a completely different family than plants that produce nicotine. And so natural selection has favored the production of these different metabolites via the process of convergent evolution on many, many occasions. And so this is just an interesting feature of some ways that species like plants, who are very, very vulnerable, again, to being at the negative end of this sort of interaction between um, uh, interaction that they have, I should say, with their potential predators, as we see in this example. I guess I should point out this one. Uh, and so this has been something that has allowed these plants to become better at deterring herbivory and being able to deal with this sort of interaction that they're having with herbivores. But sometimes plants aren't necessarily 100% good at overcoming this kind of a relationship. And sometimes it turns out that herbivores have actually evolved to overcome the negative effects of these secondary metabolites in their host plants. And we can see a pretty classic example of this with milkweeds. So milkweed plants, if you don't know, they're sort of famously called milkweeds because they produce this milky sap that's called latex. And this latex contains this toxic compound here, this cardenolide. And this cardenolide is very effective at preventing herbivores from eating the plant because it's virtually indigestible and it doesn't taste very good. And if you've ever cracked open the leaves or stems of milkweed plants and felt the latex, it's very sticky. And if you could imagine trying to eat that stuff, not only does it taste bad, but it's going to be very difficult to digest. And so natural selection, via probably the process of coevolution, has favored milkweed plants that produce lots of latex. And we can kind of look at these graphs here on the right that illustrate how that situation plays out. So the x-axis of both of these graphs shows this thing called the latex production index. It's simply just a measure of how much latex these plants are producing. But what we see in both cases on the y-axis is that milkweed plants that produce more latex have a lower abundance of herbivores feeding on them in what appears to be a fairly significant way. And likewise, these milkweed plants that produce more latex seem to produce larger amounts of seeds, larger amounts of offspring, i.e., they have higher fitness. So there's this pretty positive correlation between producing more latex and producing more offspring. And natural selection can operate in this situation and favor increased latex production. So this situation appears to have played out in milkweeds, but as it turns out, one of the herbivores that loves to feed upon milkweeds are the caterpillars of monarch butterflies. And or even things like milkweed beetles. And these particular insects have evolved defenses. They have evolved ways to be able to actually digest this latex. And this, in turn, maybe is driving the milkweed hosts to produce even more latex. And that, in turn, might be driving even more increased resistance to the harms of these compounds, these cardenolides, in these particular insects that have become specialized in feeding upon milkweeds. And so again, there's this co-evolutionary arms race that appears to be going on back and forth between these milkweed hosts and these different insects that are trying to eat the milkweeds. And again, we see how a sort of predatory interaction is driving this co-evolutionary arms race. In contrast to these sort of antagonistic interactions that we see with some plants and animals, there are instead these things that we call co-evolved mutualisms. And so this again is going back to the idea where we have a situation where one species is doing something and another species doing something, and both species are capable of benefiting from that interaction. And that is, again, a mutualism. And we see this happening tons and tons between plants and their pollinators. One example of this might be these lilies here. And these lilies tend to have pretty long floral tubes, and the insects that pollinate them tend to have pretty long proboscises. And what we can kind of see is that there is a mutual benefit gained by both of the interacting species. The flowers that have increasingly longer floral tubes, as we see on this x-axis here, are also those that have basically higher fitness, more pollen grains being transferred from one plant to another. So plants that have longer floral tubes seem to be having a higher success of being able to fertilize other plants, producing more offspring. And this is being facilitated by pollinators that have significantly long enough proboscises to reach into those floral tubes, getting nectar for themselves. So we can see how this proboscis length here is increasing on the x-axis. And the longer the proboscis length, the more nectar that these flies are able to consume from this host plant. And so they're gaining fitness by getting more sugar, more energy. And in turn, they're inadvertently transferring pollen from one flower to the next, allowing their hosts to produce more offspring. And so this is an interesting situation that very much favors mutualism. Both the pollinators and the plants are benefiting from this relationship, and selection is favoring that because the fitness of both species involved is going up as a result of the relationship. And we see something similar going on, uh, driving natural selection, driving directional selection between moths and orchids, sort of in the example we saw that Charles Darwin had sort of predicted. And as it turns out, we could look at how there's changes in the spur length shown on this little x-axis here in the orchid hosts. And this is driving concomitant increases in the changes of the proboscis length of the moths that are pollinating these orchids. And so over time, as longer and longer spurs, these nectar spurs in the orchids that we saw earlier example, are being favored by selection, longer and longer proboscises in the moths that pollinate the orchids are also being favored. And this again is driving a mutualistic relationship between the orchids and the moths. So plant pollinator relationships really very largely across the board tend to often be mutualistic, not always, but they tend to very often be mutualistic. And this probably has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of plant species depend upon these external pollinating mechanisms in order for them to reproduce, in order for them to outcross rather than self-fertilize. We can see other examples of mutualisms that occur between plants and animals, but maybe they don't necessarily relate to pollination. And this is something that really is arising or happening because of quite intricate ecological interactions. And uh, mutualists can really concurrently ensure each other's fitnesses in different ways. And a classic example of this comes from these acacia trees and their mutualist acacia ants. And so this is an example of an acacia tree here. And these are sort of what these acacia ants look like here. And as it's sort of obvious here, these acacia trees have these really sort of nasty spines. But as it turns out, these acacia ants can use these spines because they're hollow for habitat or for shelter or for raising their offspring. And also, as it turns out, these acacia trees um, produce these extrafloral nectaries that are rich in sap, which is very, very sugary. So it's a nutrient-rich energy source for the ants. And so the ants will feed upon the sap in these extrafloral nectaries. These plants also have these things called Beltian bodies, which are sort of similar sources of energy for the ants. And so this acacia tree is providing a lot of resources for these ants. It's providing them with food, it's providing them with shelter, a place where they can successfully raise their offspring. What do the ants do for the host plant? Well, as it turns out, the acacia ants vigorously defend their host trees from competition and from predation. And so this cartoon here on the right sort of shows an acacia plant and a sort of a zoom in on its leaves and its spines, where these ants are seeking shelter and raising offspring. And then there's this sort of disc around the base of the acacia tree. We can actually see a real example of one of these discs in this picture here on the left. And this disc is formed by the ants. And so worker ants will go out and meticulously clear the space beneath the acacia tree of any other competing plant species. And they will also vigorously defend this plant from herbivory by other species. And so in this way, both the acacia host plant and the acacia ants are gaining fitness through this mutualistic relationship. And again, this is happening in a sort of intricate way, but natural selection has favored this relationship via coevolution for pretty substantially long periods of time. Sometimes mutualisms become so tightly linked they're obligate, which is to say that a one particular species involved in the mutualistic relationship only can deal with another species involved in that same mutualistic relationship, and they don't interact really with any other species in that regard. And this is something that we can see in the relationship between yucca moths and their yucca plant hosts. And specifically in this example, we are looking at Joshua trees, which occur here in California. And basically, these yucca moths, they will really do depend upon their host yucca plants in order to provision their larvae. So what these female yucca moths will do is they will fly into the flowers of the yucca plants and stick their proboscises down in there, and they're able to feed upon these yucca plants, but they also lay their larvae on the flowers. And their larvae really depend upon the resources within the host plant flowers in order to successfully survive. And so this is an interesting relationship, but as it turns out, here in California, we know that we actually have two species of Joshua tree, the Western Joshua tree and the Eastern Joshua tree. Also, as shown here, we see the female reproductive organs of the Western and Eastern Joshua trees. But these two different species are pollinated by two different species of yucca moth, both in the genus Teguticula. So Teguticula synthetica is a obligate pollinator of the Western Joshua tree, and Teguticula antithica is the obligate pollinator of the Eastern Joshua tree. And generally speaking, these different moths don't have a relationship with any other plants. They only are having relationships with their respective hosts. They're obligate hosts. And what we kind of see from this image here is different lengths in the proboscises of these two moth species and concomitant different lengths of the parts of these pistils where the moths need to enter their proboscises in order to get down to the ovaries of these flowers. And the length of the proboscis of the Teguticula synthetica is pretty closely matched to the length of the pistil of the Western Joshua tree. It's longer compared to the length of the proboscis of Teguticula antithica, which is shorter. And likewise, we see that the pistil, the length of the section of the pistil that this moth is going to stick its proboscises into to reach the ovary is shorter. So there's a very, very tightly co-evolved relationship between these different morphological features in these moths that are pollinating these yuccas. And what we can also see is there is evidence to suggest that there really are differences in the fitnesses associated with different moths that might potentially be associated with these different host plants. So, for example, if we look at basically our two tree types and how many larvae per clutch the moths are able to produce, which is basically a measure of their fitness, we see that Teguticula antithica has much higher fitness when pollinating eastern Joshua trees compared to western Joshua trees. And that Teguticula synthetica really doesn't pollinate eastern Joshua trees at all. And so there's evidence here to show that there is definitely a very, very tightly knit relationship between these moths and their plant hosts. Uh, and as it turns out, though, sometimes these kinds of obligate mutualisms lead to evolutionary dead ends. Because if one of these particular species, either the moth or the plant host, is threatened or perhaps even goes extinct, then probably the other one will too. That is to say that if the western Joshua tree was to go extinct, probably Teguticula synthetica would go extinct as well because it would no longer have a host plant within which to raise its larvae. And so these kinds of relationships are very delicate, and they have potential negative evolutionary outcomes if one of the two species involved in the mutualism becomes threatened. For example, let's say by climate change. And as we actually know, Joshua trees are being threatened by climate change. And so this is sort of a delicate situation that conservation biologists are thinking about at the present moment. And what do we do about it? Hard to explain a solution to that at the present moment. But the point is that obligate mutualisms are delicate interactions between species that really, really depend upon each other for survival. Sometimes these obligate mutualisms can really actually generate increases in biodiversity. And this sort of leads to the process where we have parallel phylogenetic relationships. And so sort of specialized mutualistic interactions between multiple species can really cause coevolution to drive this thing we call radiation, or that is lots and lots of diversification of lineages, which again is increasing biodiversity, which really kind of is a good thing. And so what we kind of see in this example of a parallel phylogenetic relationship is diversification happening in these fungi and diversification happening in these ants. And these ants are what we call leafcutter ants. Maybe you've heard of them before. But these leafcutter ants have a really interesting role that they play in their ecosystem. They don't actually per se feed upon these leaves, but what they tend to do more often is take material from these leaves and feed it to this fungus. And this fungus is what they're actually eating. These ants will kind of break down the leaf material for the fungus so that it's easier for the fungus to digest. But in turn, these leaf cutter ants are making a living off of these fungi, and these fungi are being fed by the ants. And so they have a very tightly knit, obligate mutualistic relationship. And this is being favored via the process of coevolution. And we can see that this kind of relationship has happened between multiple lineages of fungi and multiple lineages of fungal farming ants. These species shown in bold, by the way, are the ant species involved. But basically, each of these different ant species has formed a really tight mutualistic relationship with a different fungus species. And these two different species are, again, caught in this relationship where one really depends upon the other for survival. And if one of those two species in that interaction were threatened, then the other would necessarily become threatened as well. So this is an interesting situation. It's kind of a quandary to think about how it does drive biodiversity or the formation of biodiversity, but that biodiversity is sensitive and it could be lost somewhat easily if the particular environment where this relationship happens, where these two species occur, if that environment becomes threatened. And then another sort of last form of different, or a couple other forms of obligate mutualisms that we can see involve also plants, but in this case also bacteria, and again also fungi. And most plants are sort of tied up in this kind of mutualism with either bacteria or fungi. For example, legume plants, which are in the pea family, have a pretty interesting relationship with these bacteria called rhizobia. And these rhizobia are highly specialized at taking atmospheric nitrogen, N2, and converting it into biologically useful nitrogen, which virtually all living things need. These pea plants have no way of getting nitrogen, biologically useful nitrogen, from the environment in any other way. And as it turns out, these pea plants form these little root nodules down underneath the ground. This is actually what they look like here. This cartoon is showing them as well. They're pretty small, but the rhizobia live within these root nodules. And through these root nodules, they are able to take the nitrogen that they're fixing from the atmosphere and exchange it with the host plant, the pea plant, and in turn, the rhizobia are getting sugar, photosynthetic products. And so there's this really tight mutualistic relationship between these soil bacterium and these host plants, where the host plants are benefiting from the nitrogen as a nutrient source, and the bacteria are getting energy in turn. And in fact, uh, these pea plants are often able to sort of facilitate this nitrogen becoming sort of available in this environment to other surrounding plants. And so this is a very mutually beneficial relationship between these two sets of species. We see something similar going on with plants and fungi that we call mycorrhizae, mycorrhizal fungi. And these mycorrhizal fungi have these really extensive networks underneath the ground. They're called mycelial networks. But basically, these um, mycorrhizal fungi are really, really efficient at taking up water from the soil. And so plant roots obviously are selected to be taking up water from the soil. But if they have relationships with mycorrhizal fungi, they can be even more efficient at taking up water from the soil. And so this fungi is kind of helping these plants gain some extra water, and also in some cases extra nutrients from the soil that their own roots aren't as good at being able to get without the help of the mycorrhizae. What do the fungi get in turn? And it's very similar. They're getting sugar. So the plants are feeding these fungi, and in turn, the fungi are helping the plants take up water. And so this is a relationship that is very, very beneficial for both parties involved. And as it turns out, these mycorrhizal fungi link up entire plant communities over sometimes large areas. So we might have a plant community that is kind of really sunny in some areas and maybe more shady in other areas. And plants in these two sort of contrasting parts of that habitat are connected via these mycorrhizal fungi. And individual plants can actually exchange nutrients and sugar through this network. And maybe even in some cases, water through this network, where plants in sunnier environments might be able to help support plants in shadier environments that aren't producing as much sugar, and they're doing it via this mycorrhizal network. And this is also something that is commonly referred to as the social network of trees or plants and fungi, also known as the wood wide web. And as we actually know now, and more information still sort of coming out about this, these plants seem to be capable of communicating chemically via the so-called wood wide web. Via this mycorrhizal network, these plants are able to not only exchange energy and nutrients and water, but they might be able to exchange chemical signals that indicate to different plants, uh, provide indications to different plants, things that are going on in their environment that might help them have a better chance of surviving. So anyway, this is just yet another example of obligate mutualisms when we look at pea plants and rhizobia. Rhizobia can't survive without the pea plant host. The pea plant host can't survive without the rhizobia. They're in a very tight relationship. And likewise, in this environment, in this sort of plant social network, these plants very much depend upon the mycorrhizal fungi for survival, and the mycorrhizal fungi very much depend upon the plant hosts for survival. So they are, again, in a obligate mutualistic relationship. So these are some of the different ideas we have about how species interact in environments in, again, positive, neutral, or negative ways, and how over long periods of evolutionary time, those interactions are really driving these intricate coevolutionary processes to occur, sometimes with evolutionary dead ends, potentially, sometimes very highly mutualistically beneficial interactions, sometimes interactions that are instead very antagonistic. But this is sort of the outcome that we see coevolution leading us to. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'll see you next time.